Hi, my name's Toby Heaps. I'm with Corporate Knights, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of a three-part series on acting for a net zero future now, which we're proud to present alongside Schneider Electric. And Schneider Electric is a company that many of you probably know well. We certainly know well, as they shot to the top of our global rankings last year, and were ranked as the most sustainable corporation on the planet out of 8,000 companies that we looked at, with over $1 billion. So it's a pleasure to partner with a company that is putting its money and its people and its efforts where its mouth is, and living up and helping to make the net zero future a reality. Today we're going to be talking about transforming Canada's water systems with smart solutions. Water is something that we all need to exist. They have this. There's a 30 days you can go without food, 3 days without water, 30 seconds without breathing. So water is pretty important for all of us. In Canada, we generally take water for granted. We have a lot of it. In the province that we're sitting in right now, we have 250,000 freshwater lakes. But water is a big business. Just within Canada, I'm going to give three numbers. First one is $20 billion. Every year, the municipalities in Canada spend about $20 billion on water and wastewater. So it's a big business. On the energy and the environment side, it uses a lot of energy. Upwards of 19% of a jurisdiction's total demand for electricity is related to water. So a fifth of electricity use is related to water. Big number. 1 trillion liters every 5 years. That's the amount of sewage that gets pumped, flows into our freshwater systems each year. And so that's a challenge. And as we contemplate the net zero future that the entire economy is getting aligned with, big opportunity for water to get more efficient, also to do more resource recovery, and to close the loop and become more of a part of the circular economy. And so today we're lucky to have with us perspectives from a variety of realms that will really help to position what's the imperative and also what are the solutions, because many of the solutions for these opportunities, they're not pie in the sky, they're on the shelf, they're being used, and it's just a matter of getting them off the shelf. In some cases, getting them off the shelf more quickly with a greater sense of urgency. We'll also have the opportunity to examine some of the health drivers for getting these solutions off the shelf and updating our water system so they're fit for purpose for a net zero economy and for the 21st century. So I'll just do quick introductions of our panelists. I'm not going to read their whole bios, but we're lucky to have with us Bernadette Conant. Anybody who's active in water in Canada will know Bernadette. She is both a maven and a connector in her role as the CEO of the Canadian Water Network, bringing together the major pieces of the municipal water system, and really being a driver. She's been on the cusp of and on the frontier as leaders are of water issues in Canada for many years now. We also have with us Matthieu Bureau. Matthieu is with Schneider Electric. He heads up as VP the power systems, and Matthieu has a bird's eye view into one of the most interesting companies in the world that's really deploying net zero solutions and resource efficiency solutions all over the world for many, almost all resource intensive industries, definitely water and wastewater. So it'll be a pleasure to have Matthieu's perspective with us as well. We have Craig Bonneville. Craig is from my home province of Alberta. He's up there at Edmonton. Won't hold that against him, as I'm from Calgary. But he heads up the wastewater plant in Edmonton. The Gold Bar wastewater treatment plant also has senior experience running the water drinking water system as well, and the E.L. Smith solar farm. So Craig is doing some of the cutting edge stuff in this country for a major municipality, and he'll be able to give us more of a hands-on perspective about the solutions and the challenges and the imperatives for action. And of course, we also have with us as an expert commentator, Jocelyn Radcliffe. And Jocelyn is the chair of the Ontario Nurses Environmental Interest Group. And a lot of people don't really pay attention to water until they start to think how safe it is. And there are a number of issues that are emerging. We still have an exemplary water system from many respects, but there are definitely some emerging issues that are of concern and that will inject some sense of urgency into the imperative of upgrading our water system. So with that sort of overview of the panel, let's jump right into the discussion. Matthieu, you have as I mentioned, a bird's eye view into what's happening around the world with respect to water systems. What are some of the major trends that are shaping the water systems of the future that you see from your perch?
Yes, thank you, Toby, and thank you for having me on the call. It's a pleasure. So in terms of trends, I would say I see three major trends and maybe two enablers for this industry. The first one, obviously, you mentioned it, climate change. I think that's no secret anymore. It's becoming one of the key challenges for everyone on the planet. Just to put things in perspective, wastewater consumes about 7% of the world's energy. To produce, pump, treat, and transport water. So for climate change, I think I could split this in two main actions. The first one is mitigation. Mitigate risk, decarbonize, and really aiming for the carbon neutrality. As we see, all countries are putting targets for the net zero carbon. So this is not an option anymore. We need to move faster on this one. And this can go as well, by looking to alternative energy sources. We mentioned microgrids could be solutions as well. So there are existing, as you mentioned, solutions for this. The second part in climate change and the second action, I would say, is adaptation. The environment is changing. There are major impacts of the climate change. We see flash floods, scarcity of water, and resources. So here it's really about creating resiliency to the climate change, and there again technology is there to support that. The second bigger trend I see is water resource management. As a reference, agriculture uses 70% of water worldwide, of the water worldwide, and industries use about 20%. And with a growing population, and more local production approach, food demand as well will increase by 70% by 2050. So all this to say, water is becoming such a critical resource and supply that we really need to treat it with the utmost care and attention, and really to focus on, minimizing waste, treat it in an efficient way, and avoid leakages, and go to net zero pollution. The third point I would say is, it goes a bit with my previous one, by the way, it's water circularity. I would try to summarize this in what we call the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recover. And so, if I take those three, reducing consumption is obviously, key in our route to sustainability. But as well to recover, right, everything we can. And we have technologies like zero liquid discharge in our industry, which are really and can be really efficient. In addition to that, we need to recover, right, what we don't use. And there it's about, linking, to other businesses that could reuse the waste coming out of this. And for example, gray water, right? I think we can do much better in reusing the gray water. So I just covered the three major trends I see. Now the two enablers I was mentioning, and really to be successful in the transition, I think one of the key enablers will be digital. We really need to leverage digital as the most viable and most efficient way to achieve the transition. In addition to that, when you have digital, you have the data, you optimize your risk, what's happening on your systems. So it's really a way to holistically manage the whole process and the whole application very efficiently. And by the way, when we talk digital, obviously one topic comes to mind, which has to be at the heart of the digital strategies, is cybersecurity, being obviously a main concern, right, when it comes to such a critical resource like water. And I would say then the second enabler is basically placing the consumer at the heart of the business. The consumers, are becoming more and more empowered, more and more aware, concerned of their way of consuming and the impact they have as well on the environment. So I think, this is where with some value add services, water, wastewater companies and municipalities, can drive really the change successfully and accelerate.
Thanks, Matthieu.
You won the prize.
I won the prize. It didn't take long. You mentioned just to tap on this, because this is a major issue, especially as we see sort of our elections getting hacked by other state-driven actors at times. With respect to the Internet of Things and the digital data solutions, which are going to be imperative for having the knowledge and being able to manage our water system more efficiently, how do we protect against the risk of and the vulnerabilities of hacking, given that our water management systems, at least in some jurisdictions, have been fairly vulnerable to hacking and not have the most up-to-date system. So how do we protect against that kind of a risk?
Yeah, I think no different than any other company which is digital and has software, right? So it's about end-to-end cybersecurity solutions. Really, tackling all the different, the whole chain, I would say, of your digital infrastructure. So there are solutions that exist for this, and it's obviously still a lot of development to be done. But basically, it's having a strong cybersecurity acumen and strategy, and making sure it's covering the whole end-to-end infrastructure, digital infrastructure.
Okay, that's Bernadette. If we focus in on drinking water, and we're looking at the digital solutions, the data, and having a better sense of what's going on, how safe drinking water is there a jurisdiction or a city that jumps to mind as being an example that we should know about and we can learn something from?
Sure. So we'll start with drinking water. I know from our discussions that we'll sort of get to safety and sewage and river impacts. I would say in the drinking water space, both in Canada and internationally, that's the area where the utilities managing it are really using the data. So it's less an issue of transparency; it's more an issue of how they're using the data to really get the best knowledge out of their systems and ensure the safety. So I would guess I'll pass it over in a minute to Craig, because one of the ones I absolutely would have picked would be Epcor in Edmonton, and we've got a lot of great examples about how they've really leveraged the ability to create and understand their control systems. Maybe the other side of the country, the one I would pick would be Halifax. So Halifax has been a real leader in Canada and so not just focusing on the treatment plant, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that one of our main themes and places for which people can make the low-hanging fruit, making a great progress, is what we call crossing the public-private divide. So the drinking water leaves the plant, and it has to meet all sorts of criteria and ensure that it's safe, and then it has to go through the system and get to the pipe. So if we talk about lead later, and I'm looking forward to Jocelyn's putting on this, because the driver really is about personal sort of family, public, and planetary health, but really on those health pieces. But Halifax has divided up their systems into what the industry calls demand management areas, and what we'd be familiar with, the more techies, really gone to the metered systems in which they can really look quite granularly at their system to see where there are problems, where there are leaks, where there are quality issues. And I guess I'll pass it on to Craig to talk about some details, but I would say to your group that the real focus of the industry is not how to conquer problems with treatment. We know how to do that well. That's about systems and people approach, but how to ensure maintenance of safety by the time it gets to I don't want the people going to see Jocelyn because they're worried about their kids drinking a glass of water. So I would say that's where the focus is, and that's where things, and as you said right at the beginning, Toby, and I think I loved some of the pieces that Matthieu said. I think for most of these things, it's not a lack of rocket science, neither is it a lack of technology. And in many cases, it's actually not even a lack of data. It's about creating the systems and the priority setting that get us to use the things that we have. And the last thing I was sort of making notes, Matthieu, what is so important from that message coming from private sector and technologies is that he's talking about the technology being the tool, not the company or the thing being the goal. And he uses a word that we use a lot, which is enabler. So, but for your sort of details, well, let me pass it to Craig to talk about some of those pieces, because I think Epcor does a particularly good job about using data innovatively.
Yeah, and I think you're right to say that it's not for a lack of data. One is it is a bit of a lack of sharing of data and availability in a platform that's usable by all. So we've kind of used the term data democratization. So everyone should have the ability to see and use that data for their needs in the broader water system. But a simple example of where I think we need to go. So in a typical municipality, if you have a water main break, generally the utility is the last to know. We rely on our customers to report maybe there's water flowing up on the street, or they lose pressure, or that sort of thing, because we just have limited monitoring within our system for us to detect it earlier on. So there is, in some cases, a need for greater data and monitoring. And once you have that, then you can use intelligent systems to really start to get, transition from that industry 3.0, which I think we're kind of in right now, where we have that, to that 4.0, where we can make it more intelligent and it's telling us more information than we can kind of tell it. So I certainly agree that having that data is quite important, and we're doing that in Edmonton on the water side, on the stormwater side, with better modeling and rainfall data and that sort of thing, so that we can better predict outcomes and know what's coming before being more reactionary to these events.
And Matthieu, I know some of these solutions apply to wastewater as well, but if we're thinking about solutions, technological solutions to better enable us to know and act on the safety of our drinking water, who's using them, and what are some of the main ones that are out there?
Yeah, no, thank you. So, I mean, I've heard, by the way, I just wanted to react, and it will be linked to what I'm going to say, but in terms of technology, as I mentioned, the technology is there, and it revolves around digital and enabling the data and showing the data into a way that we can really take, the right actions and deploy the strategy. So there's basically, for me, 4 pillars around this, around the digital transformation and tools. The first one is, how to optimize, how to maximize the assets, right? So we have existing assets. By the way, usually assets are quite old and quite, outdated. We can upgrade that, and we can connect the assets. And by gathering the data from these assets, I heard the word about anticipation, or was it predictive? But with this data, we can really pull out a lot of meaningful preventive actions rather than being reactive, right? And to really maximize basically the use of these assets, maximize the engineering, right? Maximize the dimensioning of, your pumps, of your electrical supply, et cetera, et cetera. So that will lead obviously to optimization. The second one is operations. I think Craig mentioned it, there is data, but it's pretty much isolated. I think one of the key things is to integrate, right? And create the interconnections, not only between the different sorts of data we have, might it be process data, coming from PLCs, et cetera, or power data coming from your electrical infrastructure, and even, ERP data, and maybe, weather prediction data. So all of this can be integrated so that we can tie all these different things and have very good insights on predictive, in a predictive approach. But I think as well, breaking the silos of, there is a part which is engineering, there is a part which is maintenance, right? So through the whole life cycle, basically, of the project is basically to think, when you're engineering, already think about, how are you going to operate, build, by the way, how you will operate, and then how you will maintain. And once you break all these different silos, we see that, we can gain a lot of efficiencies, might it be in CapEx or in OpEx, and in basically in overall consumption and process. The 2 other points I'd like to make is, one is, making sure we leverage digital to optimize, resources. We talked about leakages, for example. Imagine if you have a digital twin of your complete system, you can, one, understand exactly where your single point of failures, where your inefficiencies, and take the right actions to make sure you avoid the waste. So I think that's one thing, and then you can also simulate, right? I heard the word modeling. I think that's a key thing for the future, being able to put artificial intelligence and simulation so that you can actually simulate your network by making changes and see if they're optimal or not, right? And the last piece is not really digital, but I think we still have to talk about it. It's people, right? We need as well to develop people. We need to develop the mindset, the innovation mindset, and making sure we drive the change. And to your point, Bernadette, as I mentioned, software, digital technology is the tool, but we need as well the people to drive it and to make the right analysis and take the right actions according to the strategy. So those are, I would say, the highlights of the solutions that we have and what they revolve around. And in terms of who uses it, I mean, many large cities today in Europe are using these technologies. We call that EcoStruxure in Schneider. There are some cities in Canada as well. City of Midland is an example where we've implemented some very simple actions that are driving massive efficiencies. By the way, that's another point. It doesn't have to be full-blown, very complicated from the start. We can take steps, right? We can take small steps to achieve quick wins and gradually move to the optimal and the goal, which is having a net zero plant. So I think there's other things, other successes we see with a big private corporation, which is integrating, for example, two of our own software, which are ETAP and Aviva. ETAP being electrical and Aviva more on the process side. And we see their massive gains and efficiencies because basically when you're tying the two together, you're dimensioning holistically rather than just point to point. And not to give too many numbers, but out there we see by driving the solutions, we see gains up to 20% on production efficiencies. We see 20 to 30% gains on energy consumption, and not to mention the resilience it's bringing as well, and the health aspect of water.
And so, Matthieu, just a quick follow-up. I'm just thinking from the perspective of, say, a citizen of a city or a city manager perspective. There's a lot of solutions on the shelf to make our drinking water systems work better and have even better drinking water. I'm drinking some right now. It tastes pretty good. These all cost money. Some of them have fairly hefty upfront costs. As you said, there's a continuum, but are most of these solutions cost effective when you look at them over time, or is it a trade-off where we're going to have to pay more over time to get this better water, or is there a sort of a win-win space where we can invest and it over time will be better and cheaper?
Yeah, definitely, it's a win-win, right? Over time, the return on investment is actually quite fast. We see in most of the cases. I will not give numbers because I think it's really dependent on what actions you take and your actual status, right, of a specific plant or municipality or a company. But definitely, as I mentioned, the first thing is to take a look at is make an assessment of where you are. What your assets are they connected or not, where you are in your digital strategy and capabilities, and where you are as well within your goals to meet in terms of sustainability, for example. But definitely, we see that we can manage over time scalability. So it's not, again, doesn't have to be a very high investment from the start. And there's many quick wins, which, once you get into that cycle of ROI, you can invest, gradually, and then you're basically becoming a lot more efficient. And by the way, there's one thing which is efficiency and cost savings, which is there for sure. There's another thing, which is one of the big challenges will also be to meet the demand, right? With the demand growing, and we have a customer, for example, who was not looking really for cost efficiency. He was saying, I just want to be able to deliver the demand. So what we were able is through efficiencies, increase capacity so that he was able after to meet the demand.
Interesting. It'll be interesting to get the health perspective from Jocelyn, but just before we jump into that, if we switch gears to the wastewater management system, and there's lots of interconnectivity, water flows, and it's all, the water system is all connected on some level. But if we're looking at the wastewater system, Craig, what are the sort of on the ground central challenges you're facing with your wastewater system, and how are you tackling them from a knowledge and an action perspective?
I think they fall into two broad categories. One are disruptors to the water and wastewater systems both, that I'll get to in a bit, such as climate change and infrastructure, aging infrastructure and water scarcity and so on. But the first one really to me is public perception that sewage is a waste product that needs to be disposed of. And I think that really, we need to do a better job in industry to change that mindset. It could be as simple as changing our name. I'm at the Gold Bar Wastewater Treatment Plant now. Really, I should be at the Gold Bar Water Resource Recovery Center, because that is truly what we do. And I'll give a couple of examples. Obviously, for a long time, the goal of this facility is to remove nutrients from the wastewater, such as phosphorus and ammonia, in order to protect the waterways. But we also have opportunities to recover those nutrients. We're doing so with phosphorus right now and extracting it from the liquid stream and using it as a fertilizer. And that is actually a carbon offset to the production of fertilizer and other means. For the longest time, most major municipalities reuse the organics that they extract, the biosolids that go in land application programs for soil amendments. Larger wastewater treatment plants, through a process called digestion of our solids, which is a process to stabilize the solids. Well, the benefit is that you produce biogas, which is a mixture of methane and CO2. Gold Bar has been reusing a portion of that biogas since this facility was built in the 50s to heat our buildings and heat the process. But we're also developing ways to fully reuse that, whether it's through cogeneration to convert that biomethane, if you will, to power, or to clean the biogas to biomethane, and you can actually re-inject it into the natural gas distribution grid and fully utilize it. And there's other ways that we've explored too. Wastewater tends to flow downhill. It's certainly a lot easier and better than trying to pump 300 million liters of wastewater everywhere. So you have hydraulic energy there. So you can extract that hydraulic energy before it's discharged to, in our case, the North Saskatchewan River. And sewage has heat. As an engineer, we love warm sewage. It's much easier to treat. The biological activity that we take advantage of and foster relies on warm temperatures. But once we're done with that biological treatment, we can extract that heat from the wastewater and use it for heat pumps and so on, again, for building heating. So there's so many opportunities there. And I think Matthieu is right. The business cases for these opportunities are becoming more clear. Obviously, appropriate pricing of carbon helps that out, but really determining, we talk about triple bottom line analysis. It's not just financial, it's understanding the true effects, both environmentally and socially, of these. And that really makes these projects much more attractive to develop. Really, now I don't think we have to wait for 25 years to do it. And then the other big category that I spoke about again is climate change, the effects of storm events and so on. We need to be able to protect this important infrastructure. Obviously in water and wastewater, we're in the public health and environmental protection business, and that is at risk from these events. There is a pathway for, in my case, wastewater treatment to net zero. Electricity, we are large consumers of electricity. We do have to pump sewage. We have to add air to the treatment process to get that biological activity. One of our challenges is through that biological activity we release a fair bit of nitrous oxide, which is a challenge for the industry because there's not quite the technology to capture it all and prevent it. So there's work to be done, but I think there's a pathway to get to those goals, and probably faster than we may realize.
That's super interesting. On the fertilizer, so I guess we go to the bathroom, it goes in the toilet, you guys get it out, and then it gets sprinkled on our crops for food. For a lot of people, that's you can think of the health risks. And what do you say to people that sort of say that might be introducing potential risks? There were people who'd be getting sick, and there seems to be, like you said, there's a mindset issue, there's a culture issue. But how do you meet those types of concerns?
There is a perception issue. There are jurisdictions in North America who don't allow the practice of land application of biosolids, if we're using that example. But I guess I would say there's certainly lots of science to support that's a safe activity. There's guidelines and regulations that ensure you're testing the quality of those biosolids, making sure you have low metals and that sort of thing. And there's science that I'm not an expert on just uptake of those into the actual plants and so on. But it also, we talk about the water cycle, it's source to tap, and wastewater as well. So you can control the inputs into the wastewater by working with industry and so on, so that some of the things that could be harmful to a program way down the line, biosolids, are not entered into the waste stream in the first place by working with your stakeholders throughout your municipality or jurisdiction. So,
and the point you were talking about with the runoff of the raw sewage, that's something that the public, it's pretty visible that we see depending on which cities we're in. You get the days where you're not allowed to swim, or there's a couple ways to deal with it, and want to just get your perspective on what determines what's the best way to deal with it if your objective is to in an environment where we're probably going to have more flash floods and intense rainfall. So these things are happening. What are the sort of the rubric that you can use as a city running a wastewater plant or water system to really try to eliminate as much as possible the raw sewage going into the fresh waterways?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge for wastewater systems. We're dealing with infrastructure that in some cases is 100 years old, and they were not built to handle these types of events. So many large municipalities didn't bother building one pipe for sewage and one pipe for stormwater. They were in the same pipe, and therefore they flow in the same direction and overwhelm a wastewater treatment plant, especially now that we're getting more frequent, more intense storms. So I know we try and tackle that problem at all sorts of angles, not just treatment at the end of the pipe, but prevention of it going into the system in the first place through low impact development and retention and things of that nature, so that we can, again, not tackle it in one manner. In water treatment, we talk about a multi-barrier approach. It's the same thing with trying to prevent those overflows. But there's also great success stories. The Victoria, the Capital Region District there just commissioned, just in the last year, their wastewater treatment facility. It's a fantastic facility on McLaughlin Point, architecturally, energy-wise, it's compact. And there are some great success stories there that, yeah, maybe sometimes you need a bit of a regulatory poke to help you along, but I think the industry really is doing a lot of great work in this area.
Interesting. Bernadette, you're keeping tabs on what's happening across the country on this front. Are there any cities that jump out for you that are applying particularly innovative approach to have real-time info on how much, for instance, raw sewage is seeping into our lakes and rivers?
Yeah, sure. I think I could pick, Ottawa, Vancouver, Hamilton. They're all doing some but I think I'll use Kingston as sort of a bit of an archetype example. But I'm just going to take a quick step back to say why I think it's a good example. And it goes back to really leveraging a lot of what Matthieu has talked about and that you guys were discussing about using a tool to get somewhere. And the challenges being, and a few of you talked about it, and I'm sure I can't wait to hear Jocelyn talk about it, it's about how the decision making happens to recognize the real goals. So for instance, we, Canadian Water Network, we kind of reposed our overall purpose of the organization is getting communities to the future they want through water. So it's getting away from having a water compliance goal and recognizing this is all about, and I'm not saying that people don't need their feet held to the fire and you need regulations, but instead of focusing on where are there sort of some common goals. And that's been, by the way, a big trend for utilities. They really have come out of their space of being delivery service organizations of municipalities and becoming part of, partners to try to be part of that anchor organization within the community. So I think why I think Kingston is a good example, not just of sort of the technological innovation, but because they kind of grasp the, Matthieu, you talked about your trends, right? Your 3 point. So for us, the big trends really are very similar that drive this communities, where communities want to go, the futures they want to get to. It's climate resilience, it's equity in the way that we deliver these systems, and it's health. And that health is personal, public, and planetary. And I make the distinction between sort of personal, people, and public, because you can see that in the COVID issue, right? Like the things that the community and my family and my kids, and planetary. So with that kind of framing about kind of bringing in the transparency and the real time, and bringing in the sort of the knowledge piece to the public so that decisions can be more informed, I think Kingston's a great example because they've gone online with their combined sewer overflow. So a lot of what Craig taught, when I think a lot of the questions about raw sewage, it's actually most of them aren't the Victoria example of raw sewage going out at the end of a treatment plant pipe. In fact, in Canada, there's federal legislation that's trying to bring that piece up, and the biggest exemplars of those have been like on the coast, Halifax and Victoria, because that's where the diffusion has been sort of arguably more reasonable in terms of impacts. But what you're seeing in all the old cities have combined sewers. So you'll hear this term CSO. We're bad for acronyms, and it's combined sewer overflows. And it means that systems that were designed for the reason that they're designed that way so that they don't flood your basements and create huge health problems. But now what's happening as things are changing is they then allow this to come out. So I would say that in the context of your question, I think, Toby, so Kingston is an example. Why I wanted to kind of give you that frame is Kingston Utilities manages more than water, right? They manage electricity, they manage, so they have been, in my view, sort of more effective of being able to position themselves and respond to what's the overall community need, because it's not just about a service delivery, it's about delivering those services. They recognize, and they went through all the will it be worse if there's a risk here, will it be worse rather than better, and went to a system where they were gathering these data, right? So Matthieu, we talked about which data, it's not an absence of data, it's about making it available when there has been, often for good reasons, there's been an overflow, and so public can see that and make decisions. But I want to say one of the important learnings that my understanding from that system is after a couple of years, it's actually less, I think they're still their most visited webpage on the site, but what it's achieved is actually the level of sort of trust and cooperation to the issue it's achieved has been much greater than the avoiding problems because somebody could make a decision that the utility wouldn't. So I think Kingston's, there are others, but I would use that example as one who's sort of gone, taken that lead of saying, okay, this transparency, this sharing, let's just get started. And that's actually paid a lot of benefits for them going forward.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. You can go right online and see real time, anybody what's flowing into the water, and it's safe to go swimming.
Yep.
So that's pretty neat. It's also an interesting model where Kingston Utilities also runs, as you said, a few businesses, including the broadband internet business, and so maybe they're sort of orientated towards some of the digital solutions by nature of that. But we're thinking about is, our cities and, is we're moving into a 5G world, that sort of integration on the internet side too. I guess it's natural for Kingston, but for other cities, figuring that out. Matthieu, again, from your perch where you're looking at Canada and around the world, with respect to wastewater, what are the main technological solutions that are on the shelf right now that people can use to solve some of this knowledge and action issues around the wastewater plants?
So maybe just I wanted to react on the Kingston case, and I think what you just described is really a great way of putting the consumer at the heart of your business, right? And giving access of that data. And it represents as well another key point, I think, in the technology break, Toby, that you're asking about, which is moving really from a plant local management to an enterprise approach, right? So we see that a part of the transition for technology is to move as well to the cloud solutions. So from point to point, basically, it's been actually quite historically managed, either by domain or by application or by technology. But so to really a more integrated and even enterprise approach. So this will enable as well to really gather data from different plants and different parts of the organization. So you can do benchmarking, you can really optimize and at the scale of things, right? Rather than just on one site. In fact, a lot of challenges are similar between the sites, right? So it's really about identifying those best practices so that you can drive them, I would say, in the good scale of things. Then again, I think it's to answer to your question, the technologies are similar across the applications. Software is key. It's a tool that will enable to put the right data and shape it in a format that you can use it and actually take the right action. And might it be on a real operations level, on the fly, on the field, you have an issue, you identified it, or maybe you're going to have an issue because with the appropriate now data and modeling, we can proactively, take action before the actual issue is there. But as well, on how to drive your overall long-term action plans around meeting the ESG goals and your sustainability, I would say, strategy. So it's really, unifying those operations again. I think in the end, historically, it's been a lot driven by regulation, right, as well. And Craig mentioned it. I liked his comment around regulatory. And now it's not only regulatory, but it's as well, being able to drive this net zero aim and basically resilience while optimizing your cost, OPEX, do the right sizing. And meet sustainability goals.
Interesting. So this is a good chance to bring in Jocelyn to get sort of the broader perspective on some of the health drivers for the imperative to really move in upgrading our antiquated water system. But just so the panelists can have a few moments to think, we're going to jump to Q&A after that, and there's an excellent question here around what policy changes are required at a municipal, provincial, and federal level to enable the circularity, efficiency, and quality improvements that we're talking about here. Interestingly, the UK, as some of you probably know already, they have a pretty holistic net zero strategy plan for their water system, something which is, I guess, lacking in the Canadian context at the moment. But Jocelyn, we've talked about a lot of things here, from the drinking water to the wastewater to the raw sewage runoff. In terms of seminal events in the last few decades, the Walkerton E. coli scandal kind of jumps to mind in terms of public health crises and things, and the obvious things that are going on in the Indigenous reserves and other communities, both northern and southern, who lack access to safe drinking water. What, in your role overseeing this report that the nurses are doing, looking at water from a health perspective, what do you see as the central health concerns within our water system that we should be aware of?
Thanks so much, Toby. So again, I'm first really grateful to share this space with all of you and think about the costs. And we're obviously not all talking about costs that are financial, but cost to our ecology, our environment, and a cost to human health. And I think you brought up a good example. And I'm thinking about, of course, what happens when there are gaps, when there are failures in these water systems that we're working on. And one thing that could occur with you and me, of course, is something like what happened in Walkerton, or exposure to pathogens. E. coli and Campylobacter caused thousands of people to get sick and 7 people to die in Walkerton. And there were gaps in the system, but it also was a large rainfall event as well that helped to lead to that exposure in that city. And when I talk about system, it's also some human factors as well. I think another piece that Bernadette, you mentioned too, like with lead, there are contaminant issues too that affect human development, and with lead, it can affect attention, behavioral issues, and learning disability rates for children if they're exposed when they're young, and as well, adults have issues that can occur with their blood pressure, for example. And so it's a very serious issue, lead in drinking water, and that's something that happens like after it leaves the water system's plants through the pipes. So that's a tragedy to me, because it's so preventable by replacing those lead pipes in lots of cases. And another thing that's emerging that I can't speak too much to are those endocrine disrupting chemicals. And I think I encourage everyone to look into that as an emerging issue, to look at monitoring and how they impact adult fertility for men and women, and development again for in prenatal and child development. I only speak too about what happens when you don't have clean water, and that is, like, it sounds very obvious, but the lack of water and what that does to your stress and your daily life. And of course, people living with boil water advisories in a lot of our First Nations reserves communities that we've heard about, and there's still 51 that are active. Those people are living day to day with the realities of having to boil water before washing fruit, to having boil and run water to wash your baby, which I can't imagine as a new parent. So there's some real life and stress issues too that we bring into in terms of the health impacts. And I know we don't have a lot of time, but I want to say more and more we are bringing in kind of that connection in health between the social determinants of health and these ecological determinants of health. And I think my presence here is an example of that, and looking at that eco-social and planetary health perspective. And so recognizing that the connection between water and health is impacted by many factors, including water treatment. And that includes things like land use, biodiversity, especially plants, these technologies that are so important that we're talking about today, and source water protection. And so hopefully we all talked about climate adaptation mitigation, and it's so essential for health and all of the ways that water impacts our well-being and preparing for crisis events and physical safety issues, effects of drought and water availability, which is something we haven't really thought about as much in Canada as we will have to into the future. So yeah, I think that touches on a lot of issues, but ultimately, I think that a really great step that we're taking here is, and I think it was Matthieu who talked about an integrative approach, and I think we just need to keep building on that and start bringing in these different disciplines and sectors and crossing those boundaries. And by doing this today, and you guys thinking about more than the technology and your outcomes, but also about planetary health goals like addressing climate, I think we're taking some important steps to improve health.
Interesting. Thanks. Thanks, Jocelyn. And so it'd be interesting to get everybody's perspective here. Maybe in order, we could go Craig, Bernadette, Matthieu, Jocelyn, on this perspective of, this is a public interest issue writ large, water. If there ever was one, so is climate. But what policy changes would you like to see / are required for a smart water system to happen, at whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal levels? What would you really like to see happen to take things up a notch and accelerate the solutions? Craig?
Yeah, I'd almost hesitate to phrase it. I'd like to see, but someone mentioned, Bernadette, the UK, or you actually did the UK example, and it's a very interesting case study in that a few decades ago, they decided to consolidate as a regulator and their water service providers into just a handful of providers, basically chop up the UK into just, you know, a dozen or so bits and have a national regulator. And, you know, we obviously don't have that in Canada. We have some national guidelines. It's generally regulated at the provincial level, and we have thousands of individual water utilities throughout our country. But in the UK, their regulator, in their various iterations, and today, they're extremely customer focused, and they set difficult targets for their utilities to attain, whether that's in the environmental space, social even, and governance. And the utilities are penalized or rewarded if they do or do not achieve those targets. And it's a really interesting model for us as utilities to look at. In some cases, I think there's great things that we could borrow and replicate from them. There's others, just given how we're organized in the country, would be very difficult to attain in the same way they have. But certainly, I said, you know, sometimes the regulator can provide a good stick. Lead is a good example. The maximum allowable concentration was dropped recently. I think that really motivated utilities to look at their issues with lead in potable water systems. We have, in one hand, some control of it by removing lead lines in infrastructure. We could add chemicals, orthophosphate, to help mitigate it. Lots of people don't realize generally you own your own water service line, and there's also lead in plumbing fixtures that, with even after you remove all the lead pipe, you still have old fixtures that still have lead. So again, regulation isn't the only thing that has to happen. There's education, and there's a role for all of us to help with that, just with that one example.
And Craig, just quickly, do you see the proposed Canadian Water Agency that the federal government has been looking at? Is this something that might fill that role?
It's possible. I think all the regulators, whether it's federally or provincially, have a role in that. I don't honestly think one above the other is the solution. There's got to be, clear outcomes at hand. You know, we've all obviously aware of carbon pricing and so on that help drive performance and so on. So I think these regulators and consistency across the country, I think is a good thing. We are somewhat scattered, and there's great organizations like Canadian Water Network that helps with that too.
So that's passing the baton over to you, Bernadette.
Yeah, I have to go shuffle my feet now shucks. Thanks, Craig. So really good introduction. I guess a couple things. One, I would sort of say, and I'm sure if I could have the audience on front of me, like to raise your hand, there is sometimes people use the word regulation, and sometimes you're talking about policy, and sometimes you're talking about practice. And none of those things are the same. So for your question about the Canada Water Agency, which I'll speak to as not being on behalf of, but being in part of that, it's important to understand that the commitment and the framing of the Canada Water Agency as promised by the Liberals in the 2019 platform, and has been promised to at least be stood up in 2020, is not to be a regulatory piece, right? So in a sense, what we went through, all the feedback that they got from our analysis of it, is very similar messages to what we're getting and trying to act on in Canadian Water Network, and that is the huge low-hanging fruit that would be to get away from siloism and reinventing the wheel and lack of connection of data by coordinating those pieces. So you might think of government as a regulator. That's government's potential and possibility, Toby, which I think is huge, acting as a policy framer and engagement entity. So I just wanted to make that distinction, because I think if we put them only in the silos, we kind of miss the piece. The other piece that Jocelyn spoke to so eloquently, and I'd love to hear, is what I think perhaps, I'm staying at my big picture, the policy changes that the governments at all levels could do, at all four levels, because I'm seeing Indigenous governments as actually leaders in this space, is to look at their framework of policy and regulation to better enable instead of preventing, recognizing where the real costs are. and the real impacts are. So you asked the question earlier, and Matthieu gave you a great answer about, are the cost efficiencies there? And frequently they are. The challenge in the system is, no matter what Matthieu or others or Craig may think within their systems, they're only allowed to consider certain costs and make it efficient to them on that basis. And in Canada, water is a public issue, so it's not privatized. So Epcor, I would say, has a very sophisticated corporate structure to the way that it operates, but it's owned by the city of Edmonton. So recognizing that the costs that are borne by the city, by communities, are sometimes not integrated into these policies means that you're not sort of enabling those groups to go there. So that's externalizing costs for those of you doing. I think that's probably the biggest. I'll give you a really concrete example of a small piece. Halifax Water was a real leader on the lead piece, Jocelyn. So looking at saying, like, we're not going to argue about whether that's like in my sphere. I am hearing from not a single municipality that doesn't think lead in children is a health issue. They all care about it. None of them are pushing back. It's like, how do you get it fixed? So Halifax, some years ago now, really kind of got out in front in the Canadian sphere and said, look, we just have to do the right thing here. We have to figure it out. And the way that they were structured, because municipalities are, for good reasons, right, are structured so that you can't cross-subsidize things. They weren't allowed to improve the situation on a private side because that went against their financial regulations. They actually had to kind of take a collection up from employees to make a charitable fund that could be got out. So that's when the politicians want to talk about removing red tape or whatever, it's like where can that enable, Toby? So I think you know me, I'm more at the, like, how do we create the parade than how do we hold the feet to the fire, or how do we hold the people whose toes are getting a little warm and really want to go, how do we enable that? So I think that's the single biggest thing. Not try to manage this with the regulatory priorities of the past. You don't have to restructure it, but just sort of enabling. I guess that would be my overview.
Okay, that's really interesting. And the point you made about the existing regulatory systems, updating them so that they reflect our net zero commitments and sort of a 1.5 degree, which
Yep.
isn't the case right now. That sounds like a huge opportunity. So quick time check. We're down to our last couple of minutes, and really would like to get Matthieu's perspective and Jocelyn's perspective on this. And if you could, as an add-on, just in a few sentences after what policy is required, share with us a tidbit or two of what the water system of the future looks like for you. So Matthieu, Jocelyn, Craig and Bernadette, we're thinking like 30 seconds tops. Matthieu.
Challenge accepted. No, it will be very short for me. I mean, there were both great answers, and I will not repeat what's been said. I just want to reemphasize maybe one point and that I heard in both, is that regulation is one thing, but I think in its own, there's a lot of things we can do which make sense and which, in the end, drive efficiency, drive sustainability. We see as well, all countries putting goals around sustainability, ESGs, etc. So, and water is an integral part of that. So I think regulation is one thing, it will move, but there's a lot of things we can actually take ownership of and just move ahead, and it will make a lot of sense on a business perspective, on a people perspective, etc. Right. So then, when it comes to the smart water plan of the future, Toby, very, very quickly for me, I mentioned I will go back to my reduce, reuse, recover. So it's basically mastering this and a net zero plant, fully optimized with end-to-end digital platforms and modeling platforms. Fully cloud-based technology, to really enable the enterprise level, and the modeling software, right, solutions to really have a digital twin of your infrastructure, which enables huge amount of optimization, artificial intelligence integration, etc. So I won't go back into all of these, but this is for me the future.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Yeah, we don't have to wait. We can get going. The solutions make sense even before we have the perfect system. Jocelyn?
Yeah, I'll just add to what I said before and just focus in on equity, which is, I think, like really at the core here. And I think we remember that climate action is action for equity, because the people who are going to be affected the most are going to be those who are already most marginalized. I think we know that here. I think one interesting piece I'll just add, there's so many possibilities. Is just integrating nature-based technologies, like kind of the tech of nature, right? Like adding in green infrastructure as a way to address some of these multiple health issues. I think that would be, and using a watershed approach, I think would be a very interesting connection to that, where we have water filtration and rain gardens and things that interact and improve biodiversity, affect climate, affect human well-being, and also improve kind of our human experience as well. So I'll add that piece as one possible of many answers. But I think equity and leadership and expanding the voices that we have and is another essential pieces that I can't speak to right now.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Craig?
Yeah, I agree. Protection of the watershed is the best way to treat water. Have it clean before it comes to the treatment plant. Use those natural resources, preserve those natural ways to treat it. But really what I call the utility of the future, and there's a lot of work in this area. We've talked a ton about data, so I'll reiterate that, using it in a better way. Customer focus, strong customer focus in what we do that's tied to data. And then to me, it's our workforce, the skills that they have will need to be adapted to the future. A water operator currently is going to look different than one years from now. And I think those same folks can adapt their skills to operating a plant that will look very different, like Matthieu said, than it did today or 20 years ago.
Great. And Bernadette, last word for you.
Yep, that's great. So just to pivot from Craig and all the other pieces, it's to quote Erin Mahoney, who's the Environmental Commissioner for York Region, it's about people, process, and technology in that order. And if you take it and approach it from that order, it works. And the other message that you've heard a lot, and it came up with the Race to Zero effort that we're talking about with the UK, that's where water utilities, they weren't required. They banded together to do it. And people were, talking about how do you solve it? How do you do, and the main message was just get started. So I think it is about kind of get starting. So water utilities of the future, just, they just live that people, process, technology piece, and the rest supports it.
Okay, great. Well, thanks all of you for packing so much into this hour in a couple of minutes. Really appreciate it. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks, Schneider Electric, for supporting this series. And just wanted to let everybody know the next edition will be in 2 weeks' time, September 29th, Smart and Sustainable Homes of the Future. So get ready. And if you want to register, corporatenights.com/events. So thanks a lot. Have a great rest of the day and good weekend. And cheers to clean water.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And thank you to Corporate Knights and to Schneider. This was a great opportunity.
Thank you, indeed.